What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we discuss Nick Chubb, the player that just might be the biggest risk in fantasy football that nobody is talking about. Someone that headlines my list of players to avoid. But before getting into that, quick reminder for anyone that's interested, check out the description box for the upcoming 2019 ADP Fantasy Football Draft Guide. Got absolutely everything you might want and more for a steal at $5. So make sure check that out. And now let's get into our discussion. Before getting to my major concerns with Nick Chubb for 2019, I do want to go ahead and take a look at last year, his rookie season, where pretty much after Saquon Barkley, Nick Chubb might have been the most impressive rookie running back. He finished 2018 with 192 rushes for 996 yards and 8 touchdowns on the ground, and then also added 20 receptions for 149 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, technically, this was through 16 games, but that stat is a little bit misleading because his usage while Carlos Hyde was still there was very minimal. It wasn't until the Carlos Hyde trade occurred where he became that true RB1 for the Cleveland Browns. And leading up to this fantasy football season, right now he's considered a top 15 running back. And that culminates to a middle of the second round selection. I would say best case scenario from what I've seen in terms of his average draft position to worst case end of the second round. And what that tells me is that first and second round selection, these are the guys that usually carry your team, and especially at their running back position, one that is of such high value and scarcity. That's why I really do think we should be discussing Nick Chubb more so than we are currently. And all of this started with the whole Kareem Hunt signing of the Browns. Because look, before Kareem Hunt got signed by Cleveland, I was ready to go ahead and call Nick Chubb a guy that should be must own, someone that if he flew under the radar, I would be targeting him across so many leagues. But after that Kareem Hunt signing, so many things changed for me, and I do think we have to go ahead and deep dive that. To me, the biggest question for Nick Chubb in the 2019 season in particular comes down to short-term versus long-term success, because obviously we would like our first several high-end picks to be guys that deliver production on a consistent long-term basis and something that's sustained at a high level as well. If we draft an RB1 in the first round or two, we expect them, or at least we'd like to see them, finish as an RB1 towards the end of the year, and I'm just not quite sure that Nick Chubb will be able to do that. Now, short term, don't get me wrong, I love Nick Chubb short term for those first 8 weeks of the season, maybe even first 10 weeks of the season, because once Kareem Hunt gets back from a suspension, I think there will be some rust. I think it'll be some time, maybe, like I said, 2 weeks until he gets fully integrated and comfortable with that Cleveland offense. But afterwards, I think best case scenario, Nick Chubb is a low-end RB2. Now, again, first 8 weeks, he might overperform, over-deliver where his current ADP is compared to some of the guys that are being drafted around him. But the question mark is just too large for me. Can you rely on him consistently once we start knocking on the door of the fantasy football playoffs? Because as great as regular season success is in fantasy football, what we all strive for is to actually make the playoffs and then not get bounced in the first round to get as far as we can. And my worry is that if you're a team that drafted Nick Chubb that early on and you get to your semifinal game or to your championship game, Nick Chubb just won't have that same production that he used to have in the first 8 weeks of the season. Thus, you can't really rely on him to be that guy. So unless you made some moves, you're going to take a big hit in terms of production at that running back position. Because truly, I do believe that once Kareem Hunt comes back, Nick Chubb will become, best case scenario, in a rotational type of role. Because let's look at the running back situation as of right now. Nick Chubb, even though he's a very dominating guy, very hard-nosed runner, he's not the best pass catcher. Look, that's why Duke Johnson is still on the Browns. Even though he might want out of Cleveland, they know how valuable he is at that position. So Nick Chubb will lose some opportunities there. And then once Kareem Hunt comes back, I think you're going to see somewhat of a 50-50 type of timeshare. Heck, maybe 60-40, but that's still too low for Nick Chubb for him to sustain RB1 production. And honestly, I think I would favor Kareem Hunt to be the lead guy because he's the closest thing that the Browns have to a 3-down back. He's a better pass catcher than Nick Chubb. Hell, we saw the Chiefs line him up as a wide receiver at times, and he made plays. He's got good hands. He's just as good of a runner as Nick Chubb, if not more elusive and quicker. So I do think Kareem Hunt will be a guy that's splitting some serious shares with Nick Chubb. Because if both of those guys are getting you between 10 and 15 carries a game towards the fantasy football playoffs, honestly, neither of them are really a viable option. You can't really handcuff Kareem Hunt with Nick Chubb. I think both of them are just so good that a handcuff becomes a situation where it doesn't really apply. Now, obviously, if there's an injury to one of those guys, well, then everything is kind of a free-for-all, but we're not projecting that. If both those guys stay healthy, I think Kareem Hunt could become the favorite in that Cleveland offense. And speaking of that Cleveland offense, even though they will have a lot of scoring opportunities, look, the offensive playmakers there are already abundant. And it's not really going to be too often where you see 2 RB sets, because think about this. The Browns already have Jarvis Landry on offense, Odell Beckham on offense, and David Njoku at the tight end position. Most likely, those guys won't be leaving the offensive formations all that often. And then Antonio Callaway, another guy that looked very promising last year that the Browns are still high on. His arrow is trending up, so you know that he's going to be getting involved in a lot of offensive sets. So then what does that really leave you for Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt to both be on the field at the same time? Because in a perfect world, that's what you would ideally like to see, I'm guessing, if you're the Browns, but I just don't see that happening. And if you're a fantasy football owner of one of these guys, I think it's going to be one or the other. And I'm not sure how the Browns are going to do it, whether they're going to ride the hot hand, whether they're just going to favor one of those guys, whether they're going to do it based on situational football, whether one of those guys will become a goal line RB. If one of those guys is a goal line RB, I think it'll more likely be Nick Chubb, but then the worry becomes, well, he's too touchdown dependent. So again, you have a lot of question marks there, a lot of uncertainty. But look, maybe you still don't agree with this. Maybe you still think Nick Chubb will be a great player throughout the entirety of the season. Well, look, if that is still you, then this is my plea to you. If you went ahead, drafted Nick Chubb, or are still planning on drafting Nick Chubb in the first 2 rounds, go ahead and really try and look at trade scenarios after the first 3, 4, 5 weeks, because we know how people get in fantasy football impatient, and they want to go ahead and sell some guys that are just underperforming and then buy guys that have really caught their eye and just put up really great numbers the first 3 or 4 weeks of the season. And I think Nick Chubb is absolutely capable of doing that. I think if you're a Nick Chubb owner, and obviously at some point in the draft, you know, the value is just way too good and you'll take a chance on someone. And maybe that happens. Preferably, I'd rather not put myself in a situation like that. Like I said, unless the value is absolutely crazy, mind-boggling, I'm not drafting Nick Chubb. To me, it's too big of a risk, and I just prefer to stay away from it. But if you went ahead and took the risk, please go ahead, try to trade him. I think that's your best case scenario if you are an early Nick Chubb owner, because you're going to take advantage of those early, good, high-scoring performances, and then you get that long-term success in a package deal most likely. Or maybe you do a 1-to-1 RB trade for another running back that's somewhat underperforming, but one that'll be much more reliable once the fantasy football playoffs hit. So that would be my advice there. As far as some other options to consider in the late second round, guys that I prefer there instead of a Nick Chubb, Dalvin Cook. I've seen him in some situations, as crazy as it might seem, drop towards the middle or end of the second round. Aaron Jones. I prefer Aaron Jones to some degree over Nick Chubb. I realize Jamal Williams is still there, but look, in Green Bay, Jamal Williams is not even in the same sentence as a Kareem Hunt. I think Aaron Jones is by far and away the top option for the Green Bay Packers. For wide receivers, hell, I'd even consider a Mike Evans. I'd even consider one of those tight ends. Hell, if a Travis Kelce drops towards the end of the second round, why not? But for now, Nick Chubb to me is just too big of a risk because, like I said again, once Kareem Hunt comes back, I could see him taking over that backfield. Don't put yourself in a situation similar to what we saw with Todd Gurley last year. He absolutely dominated the first part of the season for the majority of the season. But then once the fantasy football playoffs hit, we knew there was some type of injury, and the coaching staff for the Rams, they decided to play it safe. They decided to sit Todd Gurley for the playoff run in the NFL regular season, and that left a lot of Todd Gurley owners in fantasy scrambling and trying to get the backup for the Rams, or trying to adjust in some type of way. Don't do that to yourself with Nick Chubb. Try and go ahead, be proactive about it, and look at your other options. That is my best piece of advice. Let me know what you guys think. Maybe you're not on the same page with Nick Chubb as I am. Heck, maybe you're completely in the other side of it. Try and convince me otherwise. I'm always open to rethinking some things, but I really do think that this is how the situation for Nick Chubb plays out. Let me hear it in the comment section, along with some other guys that maybe you think are just too risky, or that you're personally avoiding, and why, along with any other questions. And as always, if you enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in future videos.